The man came from behind with his arm already raised. There was no argument first, no warning, no time to turn. 1 second, Ted Eriksson was walking a routine patrol through Medborgarplatsen on Södermalm, eyes moving across the crowd the way police are trained to do, and the next second a blade struck the side of his neck. The impact was sharp and intimate, the kind of violence that feels impossible because it arrives at arm's length. Eriksson felt pressure, then heat under his collar. His hand flew up on instinct, fingers sliding on blood. For a heartbeat, his body tried to keep moving, as if taking a few more steps would put distance between him and what had just happened. Then his partner's shout cut through the noise, and the square snapped into a different reality. It was late morning on August 31st, 2017. The area around Medborgarplatsen was crowded with commuters and lunchtime foot traffic. The subway entrances breathed people into the open space, and the usual mix of shoppers, cyclists, and passers-by flowed between the benches and storefronts. Nearby, a sit-in protest linked to deportations of Afghan migrants had been drawing attention for days, and officers had been assigned to keep the peace. Eriksson and his colleague were there for that reason: presence, visibility, calm. He never saw the attacker's face before the knife hit. The first view he had was a blur in his peripheral vision and the flash of movement as another officer lunged. Witnesses later described how the man was seized almost immediately, grabbed, taken off balance, forced down. The attempt to kill did not turn into a chase. It became a struggle on the pavement, bodies locked together, an officer straining to control a wrist and keep the weapon from moving again. Eriksson backed away, still pressing his neck, trying to keep his airway clear. Neck wounds were terrifying because they could turn fatal fast, and he could feel his pulse pounding beneath his palm. He forced himself to breathe slowly. He tried to speak and heard his own voice come out thin and wrong. He couldn't tell how deep the cut was. All he could tell was that it was real, and that he had only seconds earlier been doing something ordinary. The crowd reacted the way crowds do when something unthinkable happens in open daylight. People backed away, then scattered. Some froze and stared. Others reached for their phones. A few shouted to call an ambulance. Police moved in, forming a perimeter, pushing people back, checking the attacker, checking each other, making sure no one else was coming. Radios crackled. Someone gave a location, then repeated it, urgent enough that the words blurred together. Paramedics arrived quickly and treated Eriksson at the scene before transporting him to the hospital. Early reports described his injuries as minor, and he was discharged from the hospital later that same day. The single fact, out of the hospital, alive, was the difference between a headline and a funeral. It also meant he had to carry the memory out with him, while the square filled back in behind the police tape, and the city tried to pretend nothing had happened. Investigators identified the suspect as Mohammed Husseini, an Afghan asylum seeker who had arrived in Sweden during the large migration wave in 2015. The attack was treated as an attempted murder. In the days that followed, the case became more than the moment of the stabbing. Police worked the scene, gathered witness statements, and built a timeline around the attacker's movements. In court documents and reporting that followed, the focus kept returning to the same brutal detail. The attack came from behind, fast, deliberate, and close enough that there was no room for misunderstanding. In the courtroom, the story was rebuilt in slow motion. Prosecutors described the attack as deliberate and dangerous, and the defense argued over intent and responsibility. Reporters noted that Husseini's age was disputed, with different documents pointing in different directions, and that question became part of the legal process as the case moved forward. But the core event stayed the same. A man ran up behind a uniformed officer in a public square and drove a knife into his neck. For Eriksson, the weeks after the stabbing were filled with follow-up care and a new kind of vigilance. A square, like Medborgarplatsen, is designed for flow, people crossing without thinking, strangers passing shoulder to shoulder, and that normal closeness can feel harmless until it doesn't. After surviving an attack at arm's length, harmlessness stopped being automatic. He had to relearn how to stand in crowds without bracing for impact, how to let someone walk behind him without his shoulders tightening, how to keep his eyes on the job without his body slipping back into that first second of shock. Months later, in March 2018, a court convicted Husseini of attempted murder. Swedish reporting described a 5-year prison sentence, and deportation was ordered. The case did not end cleanly there. It moved upward through appeals, slowed by disputes and new information, but the conviction held. When higher courts refused to reopen the case again, it locked the outcome in place. The attack was judged for what it was, and the sentence stood. For the public, the legal language mattered because it named the act as what it was. Not a fight that got out of hand, not a reckless swing in a crowd, but an attempt to kill. For Eriksson, it meant the system had looked at the evidence. The attack from behind, the weapon, the location, the circumstances, and had put a word to the thing he felt in his body when his hand came away wet. Recovery from violence wasn't only physical. Even when the wound closed and the swelling went down, the body remembered the shock. The mind noticed every approach from behind, every sudden movement at the edge of vision, every sound that spiked the nerves before the brain could catch up. Going back into public space meant feeling the moment stretch, seeing a stranger close the distance and wondering, for a fraction of a second, whether this was how it happened again. Survival meant carrying on anyway. He lived. That was the fact that mattered most. He walked into Medborgarplatsen expecting an ordinary shift, and he walked out of it alive because another officer grabbed the attacker in seconds and because emergency care arrived in time. The city kept moving. The square filled again, but for the officer who felt cold steel at his neck in broad daylight, ordinary never meant quite the same thing again. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.